Welcome. My name is Lisa and I'm the director of the Harley Foundation charity, and we run the Harley Gallery in Portland Collection Museum based at Welbeck, which you can see here, one of the great historic country estates of England. I've muted you all, but please, if you've got a question you want to ask me or Philippa, just use the chat bar at the bottom of your screen and I'll keep an eye on it as the talk goes on. This month, the talk is being given by Philippa Glanville. Philippa was the curatorial advisor to the trustees of the Harley for many years, and we've all benefited hugely from her generosity and her extensive knowledge of historic silver and the history of dining. Philippa is a distinguished communicator, scholar, social historian and lecturer. She's worked for leading national museums, heritage sites, and she's currently a trustee of the Art Fund. Philippa's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and as I say, after the talk, sorry, I'm just going to let some more people in, she will be happy to answer questions which you can send through the chat bar. We'll get through as many of the questions as possible, and we're going to aim to end the session at 12:45. So without further ado, Philippa, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. About 12 years ago, I was invited to work with the Harley Foundation on an exhibition about the dining of the Dukes of Portland, both the family and their servants, in their many houses, which meant looking in the archives at Welbeck, looking in the archives in Nottingham, and then looking at the objects in store, astonishing silver, porcelain, paintings, and so on. It was a wonderful exercise and resulted in an exhibition and a booklet. And I was delighted to be asked to come back, as it were, and work with Lisa again. I'm going to be looking at two women in particular, two distinguished members of the family, mother and daughter. The mother, Henrietta Cavendish Hollis, was born in 1694 at Welbeck, and 2 years later, her father was made Duke of Newcastle, created Duke of Newcastle. She was an only child, as indeed was her daughter. So there were two heiresses and said to be the two wealthiest women in England. Difficult thing to calculate, but they certainly had very extensive estates, Welbeck and significantly Wimpole in Cambridgeshire. It's reconstructing the life of an 18th century woman is quite hard. We have portraits, we have recipe books, we have memoirs. We don't, in this case, either of these women have much in the way of buildings or interiors, a few glimpses of the Gothic interiors that Henrietta, the mother, created at Welbeck in the 1740s. She was a very early adopter of the Gothic style, but very little else. Wimpole, of course, passed out of the family. The indebted Edward Harley had to sell it in the 1730s, and it passed away, and of course now belongs to the National Trust. And at Welbeck, an astonishing house, been many, many alterations, but it's not normally visited by the public. So these two women, who were great hostesses, one of them an antiquarian, the other a natural, one might say a natural historian, and a great collector, we have to think about in a number of different ways. And one of them is through their entertaining, through their menus. We're fortunate enough to have many descriptions of family activities. Wimpole had the charm of being flat Cambridgeshire land, beautiful hunting country, and we can see the view of the house across the landscape, which is something very special and something that the young Margaret was brought up rather privately because they were afraid of her being kidnapped. So she had this extraordinary experience of being isolated in childhood with rather few friends. When she did, of course, come to London, the family had London houses and used them. Her father, who sadly became indebted and was drunk and was eventually having to get rid of Wimpole, he was the most extraordinary antiquarian and bibliophile, and his collections formed, the Harleian collection, formed the basis eventually of the books and libraries, books and manuscripts at the British Library, the Harleian collection. He collected in many other areas as well, but they were dispersed. And that's rather hard to reconstruct his way of life, except through contemporary criticisms of him and the feeling that he'd let his family down. He did collect recipes, as his wife did, and as his daughter was trained to do. And one recipe, one early one, is a curry, which of course was an East India Company import. But this is the first, to my knowledge, the first recorded English description of a curry recipe, based of course on spices. There were no commercial curry powders until the 1750s. And this is rather earlier, 1729. It was served with a pilau. And when we come to look at the recipes that Margaret collected, we find curry crops up several times. It was clearly a popular, stimulating contrast to the traditional English menus, or indeed to the French recipes, which were very much part of culture through the 18th century. We can see glimpses of the way of life of the family. For example, Bernard Lenz painted a delightful watercolor of a Thames water party that has the watermen with the musicians, as in 1729. Bernard Lenz actually taught the young Margaret to paint, and her way of life was, although constrained, was full of artistic and literary effort as a child, which reflected itself in her later interests. The Bernard Lenz water party actually finds an echo in a description that the later Mrs. Delaney, the family friend for both Henrietta and Margaret, Mrs. Delaney described a water party of 1722 with the family, where they went up from 5 o'clock, leaving from Whitehall, and up to Richmond, 8 musicians playing, including a trumpeter, playing all the way up river, and then a picnic in the dusk at Richmond, and then back in the dark. It was a most delightful evocation, and of course it's Handel's water music entirely as we remember it. When we look at the other aspects of family life, we have to remember that the women were peripatetic. They traveled all the time. We can only reconstruct that. There aren't precise descriptions. There aren't, unfortunately, diaries. There's a diary for Edward Harley and his travels, but there's no diary for the travels of his wife and his daughter. But we can see that, for example, Margaret, with young children in the 1740s, is spending her time at Weymouth by the sea, collecting sea creatures. Her children were swimming. And then she brings sea creatures back to Bulstrode, her house in Buckinghamshire, where she had very extensive grounds and built greenhouses, hothouses, and what you might call, well, fish houses, I suppose, and supplying those with seawater brought regularly so as to keep her creatures alive. I'm glad we now have images again, frustrating for you all, but the images are almost entirely drawn from the family collections, the paintings and the miniatures, and of course the silver and porcelain. The exception are the illustrations of Bulstrode, for example, by Mrs. Delaney, and the illustrations of plants, some of which are still in the household, but most of which aren't. Here, yes, good. We will now catch up with here you see the young Margaret with her husband, the delightful, she called him Sweet William, delightful William, Duke of Portland, second Duke of Portland, who was the grandson of William III's great favourite, Hans Wilhelm Bentinck, and who inherited the family love of exotic birds and animals. And he had at Bulstrode, inherited from his father at Bulstrode, a menagerie of macaws and parrots, which were allowed to fly free in the trees. And this was something that Margaret very much added to. She, in fact, had Indian cattle, oxen, sheep, goats, which she fed by hand. Here you see Bulstrode, not itself and it doesn't exist, not itself a very impressive building. It was described by Walpole as a melancholy monument of Dutch magnificence. But the park and the gardens were memorable and were indeed added to and embellished throughout Margaret's long life. You can see here the Bogdani of the kind of birds that would have been in the menagerie or flying among the trees, very much a Dutch taste, but also a Stuart royal family taste. One has to think of even James I had his menagerie at in St. James in Green Park. We are fortunate in that the paintings give us a memory of that exotic pleasure. When we think about Bulstrode, we must remember it's not very far from London. It was an easy ride, and not surprisingly, later in Margaret's mature life, George III and his family came frequently riding out or traveling by coach, often with very large parties, to enjoy the amenities and enjoy the pleasures, not only of the delicious food and drink and the landscape, but also the natural history, enthusiasm, indeed passion of the Duchess of Portland and her blue stocking circle. She was a leader of the blue stockings. And of course, it was a group that Queen Charlotte, the younger woman, joined, as indeed did the royal princesses. Mrs. Delaney, known, of course, for her wonderful coloured cutouts of plants, very accurate and naturalistic cutouts, worked closely with the Duchess throughout their lives. They were friends from childhood. And there's something very delightful about the sense of these women working passionately together with books open on the chairs in their sitting room, in the day sitting room, that you wasn't anywhere to sit because there were trays of plants and things that they were looking at and recording and drawing and taking apart and examining. But what we should be thinking about the food, the kind of menus that were recorded in the memoirs and diaries of the time were based on very specific recipes collected by both mother and daughter. And you see here on the left side, the high side of the screen, the recipe book that Margaret started 2 years after her marriage. There are 2 volumes of this particular manuscript collection. On the right, 3 volumes beautifully illuminated, which are now in the Nottingham collections. And these include, in every case, the name of the person who supplied the recipe in the first place. It might be James Brown, who was the chef for the family for 30 or more years. It might be Philippa Walton, who was the Duchess's governess when she was a child and then became a person helping in the house in other ways, and indeed telling her how to preserve fruit. It might be, sometimes you can hear the voice in this recipe for Dutch rolls. You can hear the voice of the Dutch person dictating the menu that's here written down, perhaps writing down. You look at the rather interesting spelling and orthography. Now, this recipe was passed to Lady Aylesbury. She passed it to Horace Walpole, and he passed it to the Duchess. So you have here a sense that the actual piece of paper was seen as interesting, not merely the content of the recipe, the ingredients. The kind of meal that might be expected, a summer dinner at Bulstrode, for example, in the 1740s is described, where there are, of course, many dishes laid out in the first remove: soup, veal fillets, rabbits with onions, blancmange, cherries, Dutch cheese, a mixture of sweet and savoury that we might find strange today. And then the second remove: salmon, quails, turkey chicks, peas, mushrooms, and apple pie. And then the most costly and fascinating and delicious part of the meal, which depended so heavily on your capacity to preserve fruit from your orchards, the dessert. But we'll just look, before we come to the dessert, we'll just look at these little dishes. They are the size that fit into the palm of your hand. Unusually, everything else on the table, with the exception of a knife, fork, and spoon, would be handled by servants. You'd be served with your vegetables and your fruit and so on. You'd be served with your sauces and your gravies. But these little dishes were for artichoke butter. They're highly decorated because the guests would be picking them up and pouring for themselves. It's an unusual distinction. It is, I think, the only surviving set, although other families probably had them, and in this very personal sense that you handled with very elegantly. Paul Pressmire's interesting Huguenot goldsmith and corresponded in French with the Duchess about the design of her silver. And we see his influence perhaps in the rather wonderful dessert silver that we shall be looking at in a moment. I'm waiting now to see what's going to come next because my screen has frozen, but let's, thank you. The dessert, as I said, was the most significant part of the meal. Here, an outside confectioner, a London confectioner, very successful, Domenico Negri, at the sign of the pineapple, his trade card is depicting and listing the kind of delicacies that could be hired and his staff would bring from London and prepare for you on site. He had actually worked for the Fitzwilliam family, the neighbours to Welbeck, and there are bills at Welbeck for delicacies provided by the Negri institution, which was one of the most fashionable in London. When we think of dessert, we have to remember it depended heavily on fresh fruit or fruit that had been preserved for the winter. Fruit grown locally in many varieties. We find references to champagne gooseberries. We find 3 or 4 different kinds of strawberry, different kinds of raspberry. And this recipe shows how, or this, yes, recipe describes how to, having simmered the fruit in syrup or brandy often, then it had to be sealed in jars with suet. And of course, the risk was that the juice came up over the suet as the fruit cooled. And that would then mean that the suet had to be melted again and resealed if it was to last through the winter. It's a very practical point that is noted on this particular piece of paper. The fruit dishes, the delicacies made from fruit would include, of course, tarts. And here we see a dish for serving a gooseberry tart. It's one of 4 designs for fruit tarts in the great 178-piece dessert service. And you can see how the Duchess's goldsmith has added fruit around the edge in silver gilt. And although they're not described in the inventories, the silver inventories, as the different kinds of fruit, but we have the record in the kitchen inventory of the tins, the baking tins, which were gooseberry leaf, strawberry leaf, and so on. So, although the tins, of course, don't survive. So we know that they were shaped to fit elegantly onto these leaf-shaped plates. It's a delightful conceit. This image doesn't really do justice to the gilt, but this one does. The gilded dessert service is simply magnificent. It's one of the great treasures of the Welbeck plate room, which is one of the great plate rooms in Britain. You can see here the dishes I mentioned. You can see plates for serving, for eating from, gilding typical of a dessert. And all the spoons and forks and knives and ice cream scoops and so on are all gilded as well. They're around the other side of the showcase. The candelabra, particularly delightful because the Duchess, fascinated by natural history, had them ornamented with insects. So there are snails and little bugs climbing up them. And when the candles were lit, you could imagine the fantasy for the people sitting around the table, enjoying that sense of movement. Dinners were, in the summer, of course, would be by daylight. Dinner was 2 o'clock, but in the winter, it would be by candlelight. So that would be particularly enjoyed. The dessert would be served in silver gilt or in porcelain. One of the great treasures of Welbeck is the collection of porcelain, including old Japan and Meissen, of course. But here we see a absolutely characteristic Chelsea service decorated with flowers. The 2 buckets are for ice cream, but of course would only have held a tiny quantity of ice cream, a saucer full, under the lid. And the base of the bucket was completely packed with ice to keep the ice cream as cold and solid as possible, although it would have been semi-freddo in our terms. The little tureens are for sauce, sweetened sauces, and there were anchovy cream, that kind of thing, which would be part of a dessert, and you choose the different shapes that different delicacies you wanted. In the garden at Bulstrode, again, we have Mrs. Delaney to thank, not only for this image, which is in the British Library, but also for the object. It's the grotto that she created and decorated with shells, one of several at Bulstrode. And you can see how it would make a delightful venue for a summer outing from the house. They were certainly drinking tea and having cake and bread and butter in the late afternoon. I know there are other families that claim that they invented tea, but we know from the Duchess's descriptions and from the household notes that cake and tea and bread and butter was something that came in between that 2 o'clock dinner and the supper, which was at 8 o'clock. You can imagine them enjoying that here, but also there are plants in pots waiting to be admired, part of that presentation at Bulstrode of great rarities of natural history. This little picture was done in the summer, in July. Bulstrode was essentially a house for the summer, 6 months of the year. It was hosting parties and having guests to stay. One royal visit consisted of 55 people and 45 horses who came for dinner and stayed till 7 in the evening. And you can imagine the organization required for that. Let's see now what's coming next. Ah, yes, the natural historians who came there were serious European scientists. And we see here a little Wedgwood plaque of Daniel Solander, and then drawings by Solander and by George Eret, the German. Solander was from Sweden. And they were employed, in effect, by the Duchess as visiting professors for what was called, in effect, the university. It was her ambition was to create a universal museum of natural history, of antiquities, and so on. And she got very close to that. It was very much admired, her whole approach to knowledge. It's sad that that is hard now to recapture. When we look at what is left now in the collection, we recognize that most of her 4,000 objects and antiquities and plants and so on inevitably have gone. A few little objects here from America, from Egypt, a few little antiquities in a box of the time, with nicely labeled. We have to recognize, sadly, the Duchess, having spent an enormous amount of money on her collections and on her scientific studies and on her visiting scholars, by the end of her life, had to accept that her son was very deeply in debt. She had, in fact, kept him on short commons. He only had, she had 2/5 of his income throughout her life, and indeed lived in the main house, which really he should have benefited from. He had to live up at Welbeck or at Burlington House, which belonged to his brother-in-law. So it was an interesting situation. She did relent, you might say, and in her will said very firmly in 1785 that the collection should be sold for the benefit of the family and the debts paid. She had, in fact, just the year that she died, she had, in fact, just spent an enormous amount of money, £2,000 at the time, on the Portland vase and some other antiquities from Hamilton. And that she accepted that would probably have to go as well. And the family, she kept the price a secret from her family, but they did discover inevitably after she died and were horrified. There's correspondence. However, the collection did sell 36 days to disperse the collection, and she was able to rescue it rescued her son and the family reputation after her death. The Portland family are extraordinary, and Margaret is somebody who's getting far more attention now than she had until fairly recently, because the study of women and science and women in the intellectual life of the 18th century is coming to the fore. But I find particularly agreeable the fact that one could reconstruct how she entertained her guests and the kind of delicious menus that she offered them, which she had gathered as a young wife. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippa, and just many apologies to everybody for the technical glitches. Philippa, I don't know whether you would like to go back at all over some of the slides that we had to zip through, or whether anyone else...
Well, I'd love to just talk about the Welbeck one, fairly near the beginning, because it's such an extraordinary place and it's so little known, and there are very few good images of it. You go all the way back. That is one of the things about the family. They've always been very private. They're not like the Chatsworth, like their cousins at Chatsworth. There's been a great sense of discretion and privacy and respecting the family tradition. And indeed, the reason that Henrietta did the Gothicizing at Welbeck that she did in the 1740s and gathering family portraits was to celebrate the Cavendish family going back into the 16th century because of that sense of family pride. And there's so we have, with Welbeck, we have a slight kind of mystery. Those of you who know the house, the Abbey, will know that it's quite a hard place to disentangle. It is, the staterooms are open by appointment in the summer. It's possible to book and see them. But otherwise, it tends to be, rather as in this painting, glimpsed across water and through these beautiful trees. The oaks, one has to think of Sherwood Forest, the oaks grow beautifully in this part of Nottinghamshire. And the trees at Welbeck, on the estate at Welbeck, have always been one of the great treasures, cut down when the money was short, of course, but always replanted and very much valued. Go on one more, would you? Can you go on more, Lisa? Yes, this is a curry recipe. Okay, go on again. And here is the lens, and you could imagine the young Margaret as a little girl going on the river. And here she was. That's fine. Keep going. There was another one we lost, I think.
Do you want me to? I think this is where I came in, Philippa.
Yeah. Okay. And I see there's a question: were the mother and daughter close? They were, but yes, they were, and they certainly, the daughter acquired many of her attitudes and maybe possibly her caution from watching her mother deal with the antiquarian, indebted and drunken Edward Harley. Many of the mother and daughter visited frequently, and although the mother went to Welbeck after the husband died in 1741 and made that her main home, they certainly were traveling, and in the summer the children went between the two houses. And we see descriptions of, for example, going to the spa at Buxton, going to the spa at Bath. So yes, they were close. There are many letters which haven't been published for both women. They are not in the family collection, I don't think. They are scattered. And indeed, where Margaret's concerned, one of her letters written right at the end of her life to Joseph Banks, who's a great friend, is about the flowering of a rare Nile lily in her greenhouses. And she's writing to him to say, you may want to come and see it. And so you had that intimacy, that sense of sharing pleasure in the natural world and in its rarities. That was one question. And I would like to think, Marcia Poynton has written about women rather well, and she clearly is interested in this relationship. And I believe, Lisa, you've got a talk coming up about the mother, about Henrietta.
We do. So in June, Jo Willits will be talking about Henrietta and her friendship with Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who lived next door about Thoresby Hall, and her very prescient interest in inoculation as a way of guarding against disease. So there is another question.
Certainly, there was a close friendship with the other aristocrats. Yes, there's one about Wentworth Woodhouse, which is interesting. Sorry, Lisa, you're going to give them to me.
No, off you go, Philippa, carry on.
The aristocrats within this area, Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire and Derbyshire, were of course close politically and hunted across each other's land and shared resources. And we see the Duke of Portland in the next generation, the third Duke, sending ice and fish in the summer to Wentworth Woodhouse because the family needed, because the family needed to support a large political campaign for the Prince of Wales, which was happening in the 1780s. And it's an interesting phenomenon. It's an aspect of their shared lives, the sharing of resources. And deer are the obvious example, but the fish from the Carberry Dam were sent packed in ice in August. It would have been rather unpleasant, I think, by the time it got there.
So, oh, Philippa, I think you might have frozen a bit. I think everyone, we are having trouble now with the internet and Philippa. So I may have to close the talk off at this point. And thank you all for bearing with us. And I do apologise for the technical problems, but we seem to have lost Philippa altogether now. So because we really have, Philippa has completely fallen off my screen, I'm going to end the talk here And thank you all very much. And I will do my best to find Philippa and hope that she's okay. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And yet again, apologies for the technical hitches. Thank you.